lines of the card, we learn that Giuseppe was stoned to death, that his death is considered a Holocaust that groups him together with the other innocents of the barbaric victims of 1943. These incidents have only one meaning for people in Trieste. It's the murders in the foyer. By linking his death with the foyer, instead of a single homicide in 1948, Giuseppe's death becomes a war crime. The meaning of each element is nested within the meaning of other events. Individuals who are never physically threatened can claim victim status because of Giuseppe's tragic death, and Giuseppe's death becomes a tragedy precisely because it's part of this larger class of murders that together create a Holocaust and prompt an exodus. But it's clear that you can't have a Holocaust with only one victim, and you can't have an exodus with only one refugee. So my work explores this tension between different levels of events and different levels of narratives. Narratives tie together individual stories and structure them in a way that gives them meaning beyond any single account. This tying together of personal accounts is accomplished through the institutionalization of identity and historical understanding. And tying together creates density and closure within a narrative. In Trieste, Istrian's identity of victimization is reaffirmed and institutionalized through their participation in the Catholic Church and in a collective political identity that's at once locally situated but national in scope. So the Yugoslav side of the narrative is completely different. It avoids giving any reason at all for the mass flight of hundreds of thousands of Istrian neighbors and relatives. The foibe are never mentioned. When they tell the story on their own, Istrians in Yugoslavia avoid the question of exodus and harassment altogether. They address these things only when pressed with direct questions. And only then do they say that the decision to leave was a personal choice. And then they go on to sort of quickly mention the cooperation of Italians and Slavs in the partisan brigades that liberated Istria from the fascists. The Yugoslav narrative's stress on interethnic cooperation papers over claims of post-war ethnic discrimination, and it becomes a very empty and sparse narrative. So it's not too hard to anticipate that Istrians from Italy and Istrians from Yugoslavia have very little chance of agreeing about the past. Italians see a Holocaust that prompted an exodus, whereas the Yugoslavs hardly see anything other than cooperation in resisting fascism. So my work traces how these two very different interpretations of the past have evolved through reconfigurations of social groups, acting within the formal institutions. What did I do? Yeah. Acting within the formal institutions of two separate regimes. By tracking changes in the personal accounts of the war and the post-war period, my talk today will develop a case for the network representation of narratives. And it's an approach that gives insight into the social processes of development of historical meaning and identity. So, next to my talk, I'm going to briefly describe my data, the testimonies I uncovered in an archive, how I selected individuals for interviews, and my decision to focus on one representative town, Cittadella. In the second section, I'm going to turn to how events have been deployed to produce very different narratives about the same time period. I show how narratives are built up from individual accounts, and I'm going to do this by first using excerpts from 33 narratives from my data set, and then by showing you the entire network of narratives for each of the three moments of my work, the 1950s accounts, and then 2004 Croatia, 2004 Italy. By turning narratives into networks, the central position of key events becomes obvious. But equally obvious are the events that drop out of the accounts for lack of links or arcs in network terms. And this linking and dropping has produced two contemporary narratives about the past that share precious little in common. So the development of these two narratives articulates what has become a new social boundary that differentiates Italian Istrians from their Yugoslav cousins. So I'll conclude today by probing this narrative boundary a little deeper to understand the structural properties that make events on the boundary unique.